truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, June 27th, 2024, the 1254th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over there on Substack, and you'll be invited to participate in the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on a wide variety of podcast platforms. And of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so the day has finally arrived, the day of the big debate, the very real debate in the very real campaign that will be, of course, followed by a very real election. And at that point, we're all saved. And because, as we all know, nothing can stop what is coming except a lukewarm debate performance from Donald Trump tonight that could throw everything into a tailspin, We're simply going to skip talking about the debate, knowing that we're going to talk about it tomorrow, knowing that the words we say right now have no effect on the ultimate outcome, and understanding that we're going to be watching a television show, and what matters is how people perceive the television show. What matters is the thoughts that we have tonight, independently of any of the analysis we might hear beforehand. Let's just watch it and see what happens. Now, there's a rumor that CNN is going to broadcast the debate on a 2-minute time delay so that they can edit on the fly what goes out on air. We'll see if that happens. And apparently also, journalists are clamoring to be in the debate hall to watch the debate live. They're going to be silent the whole time, but they're just going to watch the debate. And the rumor is because there's expected to be a medical event at the end of the debate. I guess we now have a conspiracy theory. Maybe something was going to happen to one person or the other, or maybe nothing will happen. Maybe it's all just a big distraction. But as I said, this is a massive television event. It's going to affect public perception on both of these men and on the state of the country right now, and perhaps even on the one political issue that matters above all the others, the fact that we don't have real elections. You have to wonder how Donald Trump is going to approach that tonight, and whether that's the sort of thing that CNN might try to cut out from their live broadcast. But let's assume they play it straight. Regardless, the fact that much of the country will be having a shared experience at the same time for the first time in a long time will be significant in terms of public perception. And I think it's critical to notice that this debate is happening 2.5 months earlier on the calendar than any prior presidential debate in history. By 2.5 months. The candidates have not even been officially nominated by their party, and there is at least some reason to believe that neither of them might be. I mean, first of all, we're talking about a fake campaign. We're talking about a 2020 election that Donald Trump never conceded, with litigation still pending in various states, massive evidence of fraud, court decisions about the constitutionality of the elections in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But we all carry on pretending all of this is normal. It's not normal. None of it is normal. There's going to be this debate between Trump and Biden. The entire nation will see them as the nominees. And then there's a world of things that could still happen after that point. Donald Trump is supposed to be sentenced on July 11th. Then the Republican National Convention starts 4 days later. There have been rumors of Joe Biden being replaced for years and years. Lots of people think that Joe Biden's going to fall on his face, and they'll do that after tonight. But the problem is, a lot of the media figures on that side will be pumping Joe Biden up after tonight, making sure that everybody knows he outperformed Donald Trump. No one will believe it, but they have to project power. Forget about the election that we might or might not have in 4.5 months. That might or might not be rigged. The election whose result might or might not be challenged. A process that might or might not carry on for months. And just focus on what message Americans receive tonight. At the end of tonight's television spectacle, what will they have learned about Donald Trump, about Joe Biden, about the state of the country, about the media abuse, about election interference overall? Will tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions more people be willing to admit that there is no way Joe Biden received 81 million real lawful American votes and has not spent a single day as a legitimate American president? The future of all mankind does not hinge on what the television says about the debates. And so rather than spending all our time today talking about what might or might not happen in that television event, let's just go ahead and watch that, have our own thoughts about it, and then we can talk about it tomorrow. And just a programming note, by the way, Badlands Media will be broadcasting that debate tonight. I will be involved in some of the coverage. And so if you want to get my thoughts in real time, that is where you can do it. I will, of course, be posting on Telegram and Truth Social throughout that time as well. So, all right, I want to talk about a few things here in the US of A, and then we will discuss a strange reported coup attempt yesterday in Bolivia and see if we might understand some of the geopolitical dynamics a bit better. Now, Monday, we went through an article breaking down 10 of the Supreme Court opinions that would be released in the remainder of this cycle throughout this week. And it looks like some of them might possibly be pushed into next week, which is particularly interesting when you recall the timing of this debate tonight. it just got sandwiched into the schedule. The Supreme Court was always going to be releasing its opinions at the end of June. That's kind of just what the cycle is each year. And with opinions on abortion-related cases and January 6th related cases, particularly the immunity decision about Donald Trump and the Fisher decision that might upend the J6 prosecutions, as well as the Jack Smith J6 election case against Donald Trump, those are the kinds of cases that the media can take advantage of and gin up all sorts of rage and angst and tension, use them as a narrative justification for causing chaos throughout society. But the abortion decision, much like the Dobbs decision a couple years ago, was leaked early out onto the court website, which caused what I often refer to as a false start. The planned reaction was preempted. Whatever was intended has been totally nullified and deflated. And the decisions affecting presidential immunity and the J6 prosecutions, well, they're going to be delayed. So all that reaction that was supposed to happen right around this time, it doesn't make sense anymore. One is defused, the other is delayed, and the debate was dropped right in the middle of it all to cause exactly this sort of chaos, in my opinion. But on Monday, when we were discussing the Supreme Court cases that we might hear about this week, we spent some time on SEC v. Jarkesy. This is the Financial Times today. SEC's use of in-house courts curbed by U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the Securities and Exchange Commission may not use its own in-house courts when seeking civil penalties in fraud cases in the latest decision to curb federal agencies' power. Number one priority. The High Court on Thursday held that a defendant must have access to a jury trial when the SEC is seeking civil penalties for securities fraud, citing the Constitution's Seventh Amendment, which protects individuals' rights to a jury trial for civil cases. In a 6-3 decision penned by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court's majority said the matter, quote, implicates the Seventh Amendment, end quote, since the, quote, SEC's anti-fraud provisions replicate common law fraud, and it is well established that common law claims must be heard by a jury, end quote. The ruling curbs the SEC's internal adjudication powers while also raising questions about similar enforcement mechanisms used by agencies across the U.S. to adjudicate a broad swath of claims, from Social Security petitions to securities law violations. The SEC has the option to bring cases in federal district courts, but pursuing cases in-house tends to be more straightforward for the regulator compared with navigating potentially lengthy discovery processes, jury trials, and additional oversight. The regulator has argued that pursuing charges internally does not violate the Constitution, and that Congress gave it power to adjudicate enforcement proceedings under securities laws as a means to ensure investor protection. The SEC did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The case, SEC versus Jarkesy, involves a radio talk show host and hedge fund manager, George Jarkesy, who was charged with fraud in the SEC's in-house administrative court in 2013. Jarkesy sought to dismiss this proceeding, but the SEC's in-house judge rejected his motions. He had asked the U.S. Supreme Court to find the regulator's in-house court unconstitutional, arguing that it denies defendants their right to a jury trial and flouts separation of power between the legislative and executive branches of government, among other issues. And so the court sided with Jarkesy. And as we discussed the other day, this has massive implications for other federal agencies that have in-house courts, where they get to be not only the plaintiff and prosecutor, but the judge, jury, and executioner as well, often forcing settlements that companies essentially have to agree to in order to not have their business further disrupted. And that essentially amounts to a protection racket. That's basically just extortion, and it was finally ruled unconstitutional. From the coverage at CoinDesk.com, Chief Justice John Roberts delivered the majority opinion, writing, "A defendant facing a fraud suit has the right to be tried by a jury of his peers before a neutral adjudicator." Rather than recognizing that right, the dissent would permit Congress to concentrate the roles of prosecutor, judge, and jury in the hands of the executive branch. That is the very opposite of the separation of powers that the Constitution demands. In a concurring opinion, Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch argued that the SEC's authority to, quote, penalize citizens without a jury, without an independent judge, and under procedures foreign to our courts, end quote, are a violation of individual liberty. Sonia Sotomayor, writing for the defense, wrote that the opinion amounts to a power grab and part of a disconcerting trend when it comes to the separation of powers. This court, she writes, tells the American public and its coordinate branches that it knows best. No, it says the Constitution makes clear how these things should be adjudicated and it must be followed. She continues. The court tells Congress how best to structure agencies, vindicate harms to the public at large, and even provide for the enforcement of rights created for the government. There are good reasons for Congress to set up a scheme like the SEC's. It may yield important benefits over jury trials in federal court, such as greater efficiency and expertise, transparency and reasoned decision-making, as well as uniformity, predictability, and greater political accountability. But what it doesn't do is protect constitutional rights. These people are insane, always using ad hoc justifications for what they need to happen to advance their agenda, reliant on no principle whatsoever. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights exists so that people in power can't just make up the rules anytime they want based on what they think is best. It's honestly incredible. But as I said, there are other agencies with these in-house courts that now seem to be defunct for all intents and purposes. Here are some of the other agencies: the National Labor Relations Board, the EPA, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Agriculture, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What does it mean that their internal tribunals have been ruled unconstitutional? It's certainly going to make a big difference in the ability for these unelected and unaccountable bodies to be able to create and then enforce their own laws. And of course, remove the power for them to pick winners and losers and then enforce their decisions. This also seems to suggest that the court is at the point that it's willing to do away with Chevron deference. And we should expect that decision tomorrow or perhaps sometime next week. Also worth noting that if these in-house tribunals are done away with and cases have to be brought in federal court, there are hundreds of Trump judges in place in federal court to hopefully stand up for originalist constitutional principles. And speaking of things that are totally unconstitutional, let's take just a few minutes for the sham January 6th committee, otherwise known as the J6 Primetime Extravaganza, that television show that was broadcast to us over the course of many episodes. The committee, as we knew from the beginning, was improperly formed. It was not formed according to the rules of the House of Representatives. The minority leader was not allowed to assign the Republican members, and there was no ranking member on the committee. The committee featured two, quote-unquote, Republicans, people with little R's next to their name, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger. Old Crying Adam released a video the other day talking about how he is a very proud conservative. He said it over and over and over again, and then endorsed Joe Biden. I think at this point, that committee is best understood as having put the media on trial. Everything about the committee was a sham and a farce, and the media published and printed and supported absolutely all of it. They told us that Cassidy Hutchinson was a reliable witness when she testified that Donald Trump attempted to commandeer the beast by karate chopping the Secret Service super soldier who was driving it. He was going to commandeer the beast and take it to the Capitol, where he was going to join his loyal supporters in the very violent insurrection. They would march up into the building and then take over the entire country. People believed that. And that's because the media printed it. They accepted it, hook, line, and sinker, and then sold the case to the American public. All of it was obviously nonsense. Now, that committee subpoenaed all sorts of people, and some people declined to respond to those subpoenas, particularly Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro. We are told that Peter Navarro has been in prison for months now. He's about 10, 11 days away from getting out, supposedly. And on Monday, Steve Bannon is supposed to enter prison. So Navarro comes out. I suppose he'll be the host on War Room while Steve Bannon is in prison. They are essentially just going to substitute in and out for one another. Steve Bannon is supposed to enter prison on Monday, July 1st, right around the same time the country might be told that the basis for roughly 350 of these January 6th prosecutions was unconstitutional from the get-go. So what we are prepared to witness, potentially, is the Supreme Court saying that the J6 prosecutions are illegitimate, while Steve Bannon is being forced to go to prison for failing to comply with a subpoena from an illegitimate sham committee in the last illegitimate Congress that was run specifically as a television show to convince the American public that all of the media coverage of the J6 event was actually true. And I just want to re-up this for anyone who might have missed it at the time and thinks that maybe I'm exaggerating or proposing a conspiracy theory or being hyperbolic. This is a commercial for the PBS documentary. And it's worth remembering, by the way, that Nancy Pelosi had her daughter there filming a documentary on January 6th. And just a couple weeks ago, we heard Nancy admit that it was her responsibility. Amazing how all of these things just come together at the same exact time. But here's the trailer.
Thompson's committee had gathered a trove of information. The challenge, what to do with it.
The one thing that we knew was the information that we have is compelling. The thing we needed to do was tell that to the American people in a compelling way. So that's why we brought in a former president of ABC News.
Yeah, I got a call pretty much out of the blue from the January 6th committee. They wanted a storyteller. And while they were brilliant lawyers, storytelling for a mass audience is not what they do.
To bring in a guy like this who would think outside the box really did prove to be fruitful. And it was Goldston who really began to envision this as, in a way, a kind of mini-series, that there would be, sort of 9 episodes, and that these episodes would tackle particular themes.
Attack on the Capitol, the investigation.
The first hearing was primetime television.
As the nation is about to witness a defining moment, the first hearing before the country, the results of the January 6th investigation.
This is an extraordinary moment in American history.
When it came to that first hearing, we knew how high the stakes were.
Is about to hold its first primetime hearing.
We were either going to, make people realize that this was important, or once you've lost them, you've lost them for good.
On the evening of June 9th, 8:01 p.m., the doors opened. My heart was beating pretty fast on June 9th, and it was a real question of, is this going to work or not?
All right, everybody, here we go. 5 on the line, please.
I'm in this tiny control room right up the stairs from Cannon Caucus, and we count down to the start of the hearing, and at that point, what can you do?
Here we go. In 3, 2, 1.
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection.
We wanted to make sure that this was a presentation that would grab the audience and hold on to them. Chairman Thompson loved to say, it's got to pop.
That is a television show. The committee is illegitimate. To even suggest it is a kangaroo court with some authority is taking it too seriously. Now, they are said to be hiding evidence or said to have destroyed evidence, but I'm not totally convinced that they had evidence in the first place. They basically just analyzed the media narratives and then invited a bunch of people said to be involved in the event to quote unquote testify about what they thought of various claims made by media outlets. All of it was absolutely crazy. And then the report from that committee was used as the basis for the claims by that judge in Colorado who said that Trump actually had led and incited an insurrection against the country of which he was currently president. And due to that judge saying that, there were attempts to take Trump off the ballot. At which point in any of these stories is any element of the reporting required to be true? Is there anything in there from Reality Prime that we can grasp onto? And the answer is no, there isn't. Everything about January 6th suffers from that same problem, except the effect that it had on real people's lives. The story has been only a false narrative from the beginning. Okay, so we have the American Reichstag fire, false flag event, sham committee set up in violation of the House rules, sham hearings, a kangaroo court, a primetime television show specifically filmed and broadcast to convince Americans that the central narrative about January 6th, the very violent insurrection, was true in all ways. They subpoenaed people. The subpoenas were ignored. Then they prosecuted those people. Peter Navarro coming up on the end of his 4-month sentence, and Steve Bannon about to start his. And we've discussed over the last couple of weeks this last-minute attempt to keep Steve Bannon out of prison. And so here's where we are now. This is House Speaker Mike Johnson last night on Sean Hannity's television show on Fox News.
Mr. Speaker, I understand there might be a change in position regarding how the House and their stance on the January 6th committee, and it might be regarding Steve Bannon, and it may have a big impact on his contempt case. Tell me what's going on.
Yeah, we're working on filing an amicus brief in his appellate work there in his case, because the January 6th committee was, we think, wrongfully constituted. We think the work was tainted. We think that they may have very well covered up evidence and maybe even more nefarious activities. We've been investigating the committee itself. We disagree with how Speaker Pelosi put all that together. We think it violated House rules, and so we'll be expressing that to the court, and I think it will help Steve Bannon in his appeal.
Now, Matt Gaetz previewed this a couple weeks ago, and it all came to be as he said it would. This is the official press release from the House Republicans in the Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group. Today, Leader Scalise, Speaker Johnson, and Whip Emmer released the following statement. The Bipartisan Legal Advisory Group voted 3-2 to file a brief with the D.C. Circuit in the case against Steve Bannon. The amicus brief will be submitted after Bannon files a petition for rehearing en banc and will be in support of neither party. It will withdraw certain arguments made by the House earlier in the litigation about the organization of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol during the prior Congress. House Republican leadership continues to believe Speaker Pelosi abused her authority when organizing the Select Committee. All right, so let's move to Bolivia, where yesterday we got the pilot episode of an entirely new series that does not seem like it's going to get picked up. We were going to have a whole series about the 200th coup in Bolivia in the last 200 years. They have a coup basically once a year. And that's really strange for a company with vast supplies of rare earth minerals. It's like all the world's strongest supporters of democracy don't give two shits what the people of a country think if that country has lithium. But let's get the official story on what went down yesterday, first from the New York Times. Bolivian general is arrested after apparent coup attempt. A top general and allied members of the military tried to storm the presidential palace in Bolivia on Wednesday before quickly retreating in an apparent failed attempt at a coup. Hours later, the general was taken into custody on live TV, and the two people by his side, as he was, quote unquote, taken into custody on live TV, were both wearing COVID masks. It was very suspicious. Video on Bolivian television showed security forces in riot gear occupying the main square in the administrative capital, La Paz, a camouflaged military vehicle ramming a palace door and soldiers trying to make their way into the building. And so we're going to do a little background on Bolivia in a few minutes, but they basically have two capitals. They have this administrative capital in La Paz, and then they have a constitutional capital in a place called Sucre. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the general, Juan Jose Zuniga, disappeared, and his supporters in the armed forces pulled back and were replaced by police officers supporting the country's democratically elected president, Luis Arce. Mr. Arce ventured onto the plaza after calling on Bolivians, quote, to organize and mobilize against the coup and in favor of democracy. Long live the Bolivian people, he shouted in a televised address. Long live democracy. In all, the attempted afternoon incursion into the palace lasted just 3 hours. As time wore on, it became clear that General Zuniga's plan had little support. Just before his arrest, General Zuniga claimed, without providing evidence, that Mr. Arce had asked him to stage the coup attempt. The president told me, Mr. Zuniga said as television cameras rolled, the situation is really messed up. This week is going to be critical, so it's necessary to prepare something that will raise my popularity. Moments later, the police whisked the general away in a white truck. What a strange statement. Afterward, a key minister in Mr. Arce's government, Eduardo del Castillo, responded to the accusation by saying that General Zuniga and an alleged co-conspirator, Vice Admiral Juan Arnez, head of the Navy, quote, have lost all credibility. So don't believe General Zuniga when he says that Arce asked him to stage this coup. He has lost all credibility by virtue of staging this coup. Therefore, when the man who staged the coup suggests loudly, outright says, this was a fake coup, you cannot believe him. He's just trying to save his own ass. It was actually a very real coup. There was a very real threat of Arce's government being overthrown, and Zuniga is lying about it being a fake coup, despite the fact that the military almost immediately abandoned their general. They were trying to win popular support and the support of the Bolivian people, he said, this being Del Castillo, but the people of Bolivia no longer want coup adventures. Mr. Del Castillo added that 9 people had suffered firearm injuries amid the chaos. The Office of Bolivia's Attorney General announced on Wednesday evening that it had opened an investigation into General Zuniga and all other participants in the day's events, adding that it would seek, quote-unquote, the maximum punishment for those responsible. Local outlets previously reported that General Zuniga was dismissed from his position this week, which some in the country believed to be related to remarks he made about former President Evo Morales, a mentor of Mr. Arce. The coup attempt came at a tense moment for Bolivia, a landlocked nation of 12 million people in South America. Mr. Arce, a leftist and hand-picked successor of Mr. Morales, the country's first indigenous president and a towering figure in Bolivian politics, is battling with Mr. Morales for control over their party and who will be its candidate in a 2025 race. So Morales is Arce's mentor, but they are battling for control of their party. And so it would seem logical at least to wonder if maybe Zuniga is aligned with Morales and he was trying to take Arce out of office and overthrow the government in order to install Morales if only the coup attempt was real and Zuniga himself said Arce asked him to do it to increase his own popularity. It's a very confusing situation. Hopefully we'll be able to figure out what's happening here. I can't promise anything. For real, I can't promise anything. This is such a wild situation. Bolivia's economy is struggling, and Mr. Arce has been accused of moves his critics call undemocratic, including the detention of opposition figure Luis Fernando Camacho and former President Janine Áñez. So we have Arce, the current president, Zuniga, the general who staged the coup. We have Morales, who is the former president and Arce's mentor. And then we have opposition figures Camacho and Áñez. Áñez being another former president. So we've got 3 presidents, a general, and then this man Camacho. During this attempt to take over the palace, General Zuniga briefly entered the building, according to local reporters, before exiting and making a speech surrounded by masked members of the security forces. He criticized the government of Mr. Arce and said the military was attempting to install, quote, a true democracy, not one for a few, end quote. He also called for the release of several politicians and members of the military who have been imprisoned, including Miss Áñez and Mr. Camacho. Enough of the rule by a few, the general said. Look where that has gotten us. Our children have no future. Our people have no future. And the army has the balls to fight for our children's tomorrow. Shortly afterward, Mr. Arce confirmed that he was replacing General Zuniga, the Commander General of the Armed Forces, as well as the heads of the Air Force and Navy. In a statement on television, the new commanding general, Jose Wilson Sanchez Velasquez, urged General Zuniga, quote, not to spill the blood of our soldiers, end quote. So right off the bat, there are questions about whether or not this is even a real coup. There is every reason to believe this is not a real coup, and this is just an info-op, a PSY-act to provide the optics as a cover story so you don't look at what's actually happening. But now we are told something real has happened. 3 military leaders have been relieved of their duty. The military's initial move on the palace was immediately criticized by some leaders in the region, including President Luiz Ignacio Lula da Silva of Brazil. Coups have never worked, he told reporters on Wednesday, and Lula, of course, is Brazil's Joe Biden. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico, who has long expressed admiration for Mr. Arce and Mr. Morales, also condemned the attempted coup, calling Mr. Arce Bolivia's authentic democratic authority. It was under the López Obrador administration that Mexico first provided a landing spot and asylum to Mr. Morales after he stepped down in 2019 amid violent protests set off by a disputed election. Now, we covered extensively the recent Mexican election where Claudia Sheinbaum was chosen as Mexico's next president. Her mentor in politics is López Obrador, also known as AMLO. He has been a strong supporter of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has said many, many times that AMLO is his friend. He always says, he's a socialist, but he's my friend. And ultimately, what that means is that Donald Trump and whoever he's talking about have found common ground. In all of these relationships, Donald Trump is always mid-negotiation. What's important is not what AMLO's politics are. Mexico is not our country. What's important is that Trump and AMLO are on the same page. And I'm not suggesting that we should assume that AMLO is parroting Donald Trump. AMLO might be expressing a position that Trump would not agree with, but their friendly working relationship is something we should consider when AMLO is discussing the leader of another nation. And we will come back around to that 2019 disputed election. Bolivia, a deeply polarized country, has had 190 coups throughout its 200 years of history. And much of the discontent among members of the military, analysts say, stems from the feeling that they end up defending the established order, only to be punished politically or with jail time for standing by that order once a new government takes over. And that, unfortunately, is a template we might become a lot more familiar with. The global regime and its uniparty representation in America seized back control of the government, at least ostensibly, in 2021, and they went immediately after their political opponent, Donald Trump, and all of his supporters. And when Donald Trump and MAGA are again recognized by the American public as back in control, there will be and should be prosecutions of those who committed crimes against humanity and crimes against the United States of America. And if that happens alongside a sufficient amount of public disclosure and public acceptance about what has been done and what has been done in our names, and the public demands accountability, well, maybe we can actually make significant progress in removing any opportunity the uniparty has to hold power. But there's no way that would ever work in a smaller, impoverished country in the age of the one world, liberal, international, rules-based order. And of course, that's exactly what we've seen, the push and pull between the good twin, evil twin dynamic. Bolivians take their country back over and punishes the criminals, and then the regime overthrows the people's government and punishes the people involved with that movement. It's the circle of coups. But Carlos Saavedra, a Bolivian political analyst, said he saw little support in the country for this short-lived incursion, calling it, quote, an adventure of a small group of soldiers. There's no mobilization in any other department of the country, he said. It seems like it is Zuniga's intimate group that wanted to latch on to the command of the general of the army. Okay, well, that makes absolutely no sense. Let's get the official story from the Associated Press. Bolivian general arrested after apparent failed coup attempt as government faces new crisis. Led by a top general vowing to restore democracy, armored vehicles rammed the doors of Bolivia's government palace Wednesday in what the president called a coup attempt, then quickly retreated. The latest crisis in the South American country, facing a political battle and an economic crisis. Within hours, the nation of 12 million people saw a rapidly moving scenario in which the troops seemed to take control of the government of President Luis Arce. He vowed to stand firm and name a new army commander who immediately ordered the troops to stand down. So the troops knew they were marching on the government to overthrow the government, and then the man they meant to overthrow named a new army commander who ordered them to stand down, and they did immediately. I mean, that seems weird. Okay, but that seems weird. They trusted General Zuniga enough to launch a coup led by Zuniga and on his behalf, and then they immediately backed down when the man they were going to overthrow gave them a new commander. Are they robots? Or was the whole thing about replacing the top command? Soon the soldiers pulled back along with a line of military vehicles, ending the rebellion after just 3 hours. Hundreds of Arce's supporters then rushed the square outside the palace, waving Bolivian flags, singing the national anthem, and cheering. Thank goodness they were all nearby with their flags and able to do that. The soldiers' retreat was followed by the arrest of Army Chief Zuniga after the Attorney General opened an investigation. Government Minister Eduardo del Castillo said that in addition to Zuniga, former Navy Vice Admiral Juan Arnaz Salvador was taken into custody. What was this group's goal? The goal was to overturn the democratically elected authority, Del Castillo told journalists in announcing the arrests. Late Wednesday, Defense Minister Edmundo Novillo said, quote, "Everything is now under control," end quote. Surrounded by the new military chiefs appointed by Arce, Novillo said that Bolivia lived a quote-unquote failed coup. The apparent coup attempt came as the country has faced months of tensions and political fights between Arce and his one-time ally, former leftist president Evo Morales, over control of the ruling party. It also came amid a severe economic crisis. The clashes have paralyzed the government's efforts to deal with the economic crisis. For example, Morales' allies in Congress have consistently thwarted Arce's attempts to take on debt to relieve some of the pressure. Darn, he can't go out and borrow money from globalist bankers. Zuniga referenced that paralysis during the rebellion, telling reporters the military was tired of the infighting and was seeking to, quote-unquote, restore democracy. "We are listening to the cry of the people because for many years an elite has taken control of the country," he said, adding that politicians are, quote, "destroying the country. Look at what situation we are in, what crisis they have left us in," end quote. The armed forces intend to restore the democracy to make it a true democracy, he said. The rapidly unfolding crisis began in the afternoon as the streets of La Paz started filling with soldiers. Arce tweeted that the troops' deployment was irregular, and soon he and other political figures warned of an attempted coup. Still, the apparent attempt to depose the sitting president seemed to lack any meaningful support, and even Arce's rivals closed ranks to defend democracy and repudiate the uprising. In a twist, Zuniga claimed in comments to journalists before his arrest that Arce himself told the general to storm the palace in a political move. "The president told me the situation is very screwed up, very critical. It is necessary to prepare something to raise my popularity," Zuniga quoted the Bolivian leader as saying. Zuniga said he asked Arce if he should, quote, "take out the armored vehicles," and Arce replied, "take them out." Justice Minister Ivan Lima denied Zuniga's claims, saying the general was lying and trying to justify his actions, for which he said he will face justice. prosecutors will seek the maximum sentence of 15 to 20 years in prison for Zuniga, Lima said via the social media platform X, for having attacked democracy and the Constitution. I cannot believe that staging a coup against your country as a military general will only get you 15 to 20 years. The spectacle shocked Bolivians, no stranger to political unrest. In 2019, Morales was ousted as president following an earlier political crisis. As the crisis unfolded Wednesday, Arce confronted Zuniga in the palace hallway, as shown on video on Bolivian television. I am your captain, and I order you to withdraw your soldiers, and I will not allow this insubordination, Arce said. Surrounded by ministers, he added, here we are, firm in Casa Grande, to confront any coup attempt. We will need the Bolivian people to organize. Less than an hour later, Arce announced new heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force amid the roar of supporters and thanked the country's police and regional allies for standing by him. Arce said the troops who rose against him were staining the uniform of the military. I order all that are mobilized to return to their units, said the newly named Army Chief Jose Wilson Sanchez. No one wants the images we're seeing in the streets. And oh, what a photo shoot they had. There are some very dramatic pictures that they published. Shortly after, the armored vehicles roared out of the plaza, tailed by hundreds of military fighters as police in riot gear set up blockades outside the government palace. The incident was met with a wave of outrage by other regional leaders, including the Organization of American States, Chilean President Gabriel Boric, the leader of Honduras, and former Bolivian leaders. Gustavo Flores Macias, a professor of government and public policy focusing on Latin America at Cornell University, said it's important that world leaders and organizations keep up their condemnation of the coup attempt as developments unfold. If we allow the interruption of the constitutional order to take place in Bolivia, it could serve a demonstration effect, Flores Macias said from New York in an interview with the Associated Press. It could send a signal that if this is okay to happen in Bolivia, it could happen elsewhere. And yes, surely the rest of the world now knows that coups are just not okay. They tried a coup and democracy prevailed. Bolivia has seen intensifying protests in recent months over the economy's precipitous decline from one of the continent's fastest growing 2 decades ago to one of the most crisis-stricken. And we know how the regime loves to cause a crisis when they are losing control. A quote-unquote protest movement followed by a quote-unquote coup. I'm sure all of this is happening naturally, according to the people's demands. Arce and Morales have been battling for the future of Bolivia's splintering Movement for Socialism, known by its Spanish acronym MAS, ahead of elections in 2025. Following Wednesday's chaos, reports on local media showed Bolivians stocking up on food and other essentials in supermarkets, concerned about what will come next. And that's weird. The people of Bolivia are scared that a fake coup attempt that was immediately shut down is going to throw the country into chaos to the point where they can't get food. Now, either the people are scrambling for food and it's for a reason other than this, or we're just being told that, and that's not real. I have a hard time believing that the people of Bolivia buy all this. But addressing supporters outside the presidential palace, the country's vice president, David Choquehuanca, vowed, quote, never again will the Bolivian people permit coup attempts. And let's hope all of that is true for their sake, but maybe we should wait, 6 months or a year just to be sure, since they have one coup per year. Let's continue with the official story. This from the Financial Times. Bolivian general arrested after apparent coup attempt. Just going to hit a couple quotes here. Today, the country is facing an attempted coup d'etat, President Luis Arce said in the address. Once again, the country is up against those who want democracy in Bolivia to be cut short. The article features a picture with the soldiers in the street, some of them with masks on. Is the very deadly pandemic down in Bolivia? Let's continue with the Financial Times. Arce, a one-time protege of former leftist leader Evo Morales, called on Bolivians to, quote, mobilize against the coup plotters. He then replaced Zuniga with an army commander who called on the soldiers to stand down. Within a few hours, Arce was victoriously pumping his fists in the air and thanking supporters in the Plaza Murillo after soldiers withdrew in a convoy of military vehicles. Earlier, Zuniga, in military uniform, told a television crew outside the palace that, quote, the three chiefs of the armed forces have come to express our dismay. He said there would be, quote, a new cabinet of ministers. Surely things will change, but our country cannot continue like this any longer, end quote. Zuniga also demanded the release of several jailed politicians, including two opposition leaders, former President Janine Áñez, who briefly led Bolivia from 2019 to 2020, and Luis Fernando Camacho, a former provincial governor. So now we're told that Zuniga is staging this coup to free Camacho and Áñez, but also that Arce asked him to stage the coup in order to increase his own popularity. Zuniga this week said Morales, who initially claimed a victory in a disputed presidential election in 2019 but later resigned, should not be allowed to run again for president. Tensions have been rising in Bolivia in recent weeks as Arce and Morales, former allies from the ruling Movement Towards Socialism party, have been engaged in a caustic split. Morales, who still wields significant influence, called on his supporters to mobilize in support of democracy. We will not allow the armed forces to violate democracy and intimidate people, Morales posted on X. So Morales, who is in a political battle with Arce, the current president, whom Morales used to mentor, but Morales is essentially saying, yes, we're in a battle, but I don't want it one like this, not with the military staging a coup. Morales and Arce are coming back together. Mentor and mentee, then rivals, are now coming back together to unite the people in opposition to this coup. Morales, a former coca farmer who led the country from 2006 to 2019, said he will run against Arce in next year's presidential election. His term was marked by Democratic backsliding as he championed indigenous rights. And that's one of those sentences you just never think you'll read from regime media. Democracy was backsliding while the indigenous leader was focused on indigenous rights? I thought that's the sort of thing that was championed in our democracy. The article concludes this way. The U.S. was closely monitoring the situation and urged calm and restraint, a White House national security spokesperson said. Why can't they just name the spokesperson? Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, said, quote, the European Union condemns any attempt to break constitutional order in Bolivia and overthrow democratically elected governments. And what could that possibly even mean in a country with 190 coups in the last 200 years? Not to mention the fact that Morales himself was accused of election fraud and forced to resign just 5 years ago. This is from the UK's iNews. The headline, Bolivian coup attempt may have been staged, say experts. And again, not going to go through the entire article. Chris Sabatini, a Latin America expert at Chatham House, a globalist think tank, told it appears that this is no ordinary coup. It does look staged. I think we're probably looking at an internecine power battle between President Arce and former President Evo Morales. Arce, the current leader, is a center-left technocrat. Morales, a Marxist figure who fled Bolivia in 2019 after claims of a rigged election. Tensions have been rising in Bolivia in recent weeks as the pair, formerly allies from the ruling Movement Toward Socialism party, have bickered over the state of the country. Morales, a charismatic three-time president who still wields significant influence, called on his supporters to mobilize in support of democracy. We will not allow the armed forces to violate democracy and intimidate people, Morales posted on X. he plans to run for re-election against his one-time ally in general elections next year. Sabatini added, "It may have been staged by Morales to show that he still has power over the state and the army. Or it might have been organized by Arce to make himself look strong, an insider job to show he has popular support and is able to make the rebels stand down. I think this latter theory is the most likely," end quote. Ryan Berg, director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that is another globalist think tank that we've discussed many times, tweeted his doubts about the supposed coup attempt. "Lots of confusion and chaos right now. Not really any answers. Was this a coup attempt? Why does the military support Arce, quote unquote, for now? Is this a false flag to shore up mass support? And what role, if any, did Evo Morales have in this? Too many open questions." Sabatini adds that it might not be a coincidence that this apparent coup happened just as leaders from across the continent are meeting in Paraguay at the Organization of American States, whose members are supposed to come to the aid of others and support their democracy. Luis Almagro, the Organization of American States' Secretary General, called on the army to recognize legitimately elected civil power in Bolivia. In Bolivia, over the next few hours and days, I expect we will see more recriminations and rumors, and accusations will be made against the person or parties who faked the coup, if that's what really happened, Sabatini says. So the people at the globalist think tanks don't know where to come down on this supposed attempted coup. These are the people who are normally telling us that false flags don't happen. They're conspiracy theories. They're not real events. We certainly couldn't have a false flag that would make it look like a country's being taken over. I mean, sure, we had America's Reichstag fire, the very violent insurrection of January 6th, 2021. And then a couple years later, Brazil had almost the same incident in response to the so-called election of Lula da Silva. But those weren't false flags. Those were real. This might be a false flag. And I find this amusing because on some level you have to understand that they know this isn't real. But it also sounds like they're not sure where to come down on it yet. But still, all we have in a real sense is various attempts to frame the narrative in certain ways. 3 top military leaders in Bolivia, we're told, relieved of their command, and regime experts having no clue about how they're supposed to react. Now let's just get some background on Bolivia from Wikipedia. Bolivia, officially the plurinational state of Bolivia, is a landlocked country located in western central South America. It's bordered by Brazil to the north and east, Paraguay to the southeast, Argentina to the south, Chile to the southwest, and Peru to the west. I noted before that the administrative capital is in La Paz and the constitutional capital is in Sucre. That's where the judiciary resides. Now, plurinationalism, according to Wikipedia, is defined as the coexistence of 2 or more sealed or preserved national groups within a polity. In plurinationalism, the idea of nationality is plural, meaning there are many nationals within an organized community or body of peoples. Reportedly, the term has its origin with the indigenous political movement in Bolivia, where it was first heard of in the early 1980s. This seems to be mostly centered around the indigenous people defining and in some sense having their own separate nation within a nation. And I suppose in some sense you could say the United States is like that as well with the Native American reservations. Bolivia experienced a succession of military and civilian governments until Hugo Banzer led a CIA-supported coup d'etat in 1971. So much happening around the world in 1971. Replacing the socialist government of Juan José Torres with a military dictatorship. Banzer's regime cracked down on left-wing and socialist opposition parties and other perceived forms of dissent, resulting in the torturing and murders of countless Bolivian citizens. Banzer was ousted in 1978 and 20 years later returned as the democratically elected president of Bolivia. So the CIA brought in a military dictatorship. Then that was ended and he was re-elected as the president in a very real election. Under the 2006 to 2019 presidency of Evo Morales, the country saw significant economic growth and political stability, but was also widely accused of democratic backsliding and was described as a competitive, authoritarian regime. Freedom House classifies Bolivia as a partly free democracy as of 2023 with a 66 out of 100 score. And I'm sure they've nailed it. In the 1997 elections, General Hugo Banzer, leader of the Nationalist Democratic Action Party and former dictator, won 22% of the vote, while the MNR candidate won 18%. At the outset of his government, President Banzer launched a policy of using special police units to eradicate physically the illegal coca of the Chapare region. The revolutionary left movement, that is the MIR, of Jaime Paz Zamora, remained a coalition partner throughout the Banzer government, supporting his policy called the Dignity Plan. So the revolutionary movement supported the Dignity Plan of the dictator installed by the CIA. And that kind of just caught my eye because the overthrow of Ukraine in 2014 is called the Revolution of Dignity. The same playbook plays over and over again, making use of the same concepts and the same marketing. The Banzer government basically continued the free market and privatization policies of its predecessor. The relatively robust economic growth of the mid-1990s continued till about the third year of its term in office. After that, regional, global, and domestic factors contributed to a decline in economic growth. Financial crises in Argentina and Brazil, lower world prices for export commodities, and reduced employment in the coca sector depressed the Bolivian economy. The public also perceived a significant amount of public sector corruption. These factors contributed to increasing social protests during the second half of Banzer's term. Between January 1999 and April 2000, large protests erupted in Cochabamba, Bolivia's third largest city at the time, in response to the privatization of water resources by foreign companies and a subsequent doubling of water prices. On 6 August 2001, Banzer resigned from office after being diagnosed with cancer. He died less than a year later. Vice President Jorge Fernando Quiroga Ramirez completed the final year of his term. So incredible instability in this country. Battles over water resources. Battles over coca farming, which would lead to the drug trade. The CIA deeply involved. And you know how they love to occupy a Central or South American nation and control the drug trade on behalf of, let's say, pharmaceutical companies. And no, I'm not talking about Afghanistan. And then, of course, you got to remember, Bolivia has that lithium. In 2003, there was a gas conflict. The government imposed martial law. People were shot by police, 16 dead and several dozen wounded. Faced with the option of resigning or more bloodshed, Sanchez de Lozada, this is the man following Banzer, offered his resignation in a letter to an emergency session of Congress. After his resignation was accepted and his vice president, Carlos Mesa, invested, he left on a commercially scheduled flight for the United States. So this president is removed and immediately flies to the United States. Evo Morales, by the way, finished second in that election to Sanchez de Lozada. Carlos Mesa himself then attempted to resign a couple years later. The Congress said no. He tried again a few months after that. The Congress finally said yes, and he was replaced by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Eduardo Rodriguez. Evo Morales won in 2006 and announced that he was going to renationalize the Bolivian hydrocarbon assets following protests that demanded that action. It sounds very much like this country is trying to reclaim its power and its resources from the global regime, who consistently had a way of just taking the country over again and again. 2009 marked the creation of a new constitution and the renaming of the country to the plurinational state of Bolivia. Before that, it was the Republic of Bolivia. During his third term, Evo Morales began to plan for a fourth, and the 2016 Bolivian constitutional referendum asked voters to override the constitution and allow Evo Morales to run for an additional term in office. Morales narrowly lost the referendum. However, in 2017, his party then petitioned the Bolivian Constitutional Court to override the Constitution on the basis that the American Convention on Human Rights made term limits a human rights violation. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights determined that term limits are not a human rights violation in 2018. However, once again, the Bolivian Constitutional Court ruled that Morales has permission to run for a fourth term in the 2019 elections, and this permission was not retracted. And think about that, a serious claim that term limits would be a violation of human rights. And in my mind, that totally makes sense. People are very committed to the idea of term limits as being some part of the solution with our government. I don't believe in that at all. Legitimate elections will take care of that problem. We don't have legitimate elections here. We have fake elections. In a situation where we have real elections, assuming that we have some form of government on into the future, and the people want to keep electing the same representatives, they should be allowed to do that. The politicians in office are there to be serving the will of the people. If they are effectively doing that and the people want them to do it again, it seems insane to disallow that. If we implemented term limits without fixing the elections, virtually nothing would be fixed in any way. Now, just as an aside here, Evo Morales, who we've already noted was a coca farmer before becoming a politician, has what seems to be an adversarial relationship with the DEA going back at least 20 years. Now, during the 2019 election, they have like a real-time counter that updates the public, and then they have the final count that's released later. And the real-time count was stopped after reporting about 86% of the vote. Morales was up by just over 10 percentage points, and he requires a 10 percentage point lead to avoid a runoff. When they announced the final result, he had prevented the runoff just barely. And so there were all sorts of claims of election fraud. And Morales defended himself. He even went so far as to say, if you can find any fraud, we'll go ahead and have the runoff election. From the Wikipedia entry, amidst allegations of fraud perpetrated by the Morales government, widespread protests were organized to dispute the election. On 10 November, the Organization of American States released a preliminary report concluding several irregularities in the election, though these findings were heavily disputed. The New York Times reported on June 7, 2020, that the OAS analysis immediately after the 20 October election was flawed, yet fueled, quote, a chain of events that changed the South American nation's history. Now, again, the election was in late 2019. This article from Reuters, March 1st, 2020, study casting doubt on Bolivian election fraud triggers controversy. The analysis by two researchers in MIT's Election Data and Science Lab made public last week stated that an Organization of American States finding that fraud helped Morales win was flawed and concluded that it was very likely the socialist president won the October vote by the 10 percentage points needed to avoid a runoff. The OAS, in a statement on Friday, dismissed the MIT study as unscientific. Now, if MIT is going to do a study, you would expect that they would be doing it on behalf of the global regime. And what they are reporting is that Morales' win was legitimate. He barely won, but his win was legitimate, contrary to the claims of the OAS. The Reuters article says the OAS report cited several violations in the October election, including a hidden computer server designed to tilt the vote toward Morales, who served as Bolivia's president for 14 years. Morales resigned amid violence in Bolivia in the aftermath of the election fraud allegations, declaring he was the victim of a coup. Morales has said he will return to Bolivia, and again, this is 2020, but has been charged by the caretaker government with sedition and blocked from running as a candidate for senator. Venezuela's socialist president, Nicolas Maduro, reiterated his claim that the OAS is a tool of the United States, posting on Twitter on Sunday that the MIT study was, quote, more proof that the Ministry of the Colonies, that's the OAS, threatens the will of the free peoples of the continent. Back to Wikipedia. After weeks of protests, Morales resigned on national television shortly after the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, General Williams Callisman, had urged that he do so to restore peace and stability. Opposition Senator Janine Áñez declared herself interim president, claiming constitutional succession after the president, vice president, and both heads of the legislative chambers. She was confirmed as interim president by the Constitutional Court, who declared her succession to be constitutional and automatic. International politicians, scholars, and journalists are divided between describing the event as a coup or a spontaneous social uprising against an unconstitutional fourth term. Now, it is odd to call it unconstitutional when the courts ruled that he could run. It's like they have two constitutions or something just because they wrote a new one in 2009. But that would be crazy, and that doesn't happen anywhere, and certainly not in the United States of America. We have had the exact same constitution the entire time, and it could never be upended or overturned. That's how strong it was. Protests to reinstate Morales as president continue becoming highly violent, burning public buses and private houses, destroying public infrastructure, and harming pedestrians. The protests were met with more violence by security forces against Morales supporters after Áñez exempted police and military from criminal responsibility and operations for, quote, the restoration of order and public stability. In April 2020, the interim government took out a loan of more than $327 million from the International Monetary Fund to meet the country's needs during the COVID-19 pandemic. How about that? New elections were scheduled for the 3rd of May. In response to the pandemic, the Bolivian electoral body, the TSE, made an announcement postponing the election. MAS, that's Morales' party, and Arce's party, reluctantly agreed with the first delay only. The date for the new election was delayed twice more in the face of massive protests and violence. The final proposed date for the elections was October 18, 2020. Observers from the OAS, the UN, and other bodies reported that they found no fraudulent actions in the 2020 elections. So even the body that claimed fraud just a year before in Morales' election now says no fraud. The general election had a record voter turnout of 88.4% and ended in a landslide win for MAS, which took 55.1% of the votes compared to just 28.8% for former centrist president Carlos Mesa. Mesa was the man who came in second to Morales in 2019. Both Mesa and Áñez conceded defeat. That is rather amazing. 88.4% turnout. Just about everyone went out and voted. Incredible. Now, on that Wikipedia page, they have a picture from the inauguration of Luis Arce in November 2020, and all of the 11 people pictured are standing there like idiots in COVID masks. An official photo for their inauguration, and they're all wearing COVID masks. A few months after that inauguration, Arce's government returned $351 million to the IMF. The Wikipedia entry says this comprised a loan of $327 million taken out by the interim government in April 2020 and interest of around $24 million. The government said it returned the loan to protect Bolivia's economic sovereignty and because the conditions attached to the loan were unacceptable. This would normally read as a sovereign nation separating itself from the influence of the global regime. Now, speaking of COVID, there's an interesting article in the Gray Zone that is Max Blumenthal's website, the son of Sidney Blumenthal. And this article is from August 2nd, 2020, while Áñez was the interim president, before Arce was elected. The headline, while Bolivia's coup regime lets its citizens die, Cuba has nearly defeated COVID-19. And of course, everyone remembers these headlines when a country was going along with the global regime's agenda They were doing the best they could to save people, and if they weren't going along with that agenda, then they were killing everyone's grandma or carrying out an experiment in human sacrifice, as the Atlantic's Amanda Mull called the reopening of businesses in Georgia in May of 2020. Journalists are absolutely nuts. But from this article, Bolivia has almost no discernible strategy. Following the coup against Evo Morales in November 2019, Bolivia focused instead on purging its public sphere of anything that could be remotely connected to Cuba. The new government formally broke off diplomatic relations and expelled the 700 Cuban medical professionals stationed there. While Bolivian health ministers once sought to emulate Cuba, the coup government of Janine Áñez turned to the private sector and appointed Marcelo Navajas, an owner of an elite private clinic in the upper-class south side of La Paz, as health minister, just as COVID-19 cases began to surge. The ideological divergence handicapped the country as it careened into the current health crisis. So Áñez is the beneficiary of a coup. She was installed by a coup, according to the Gray Zone. And let's look at one more article from the Gray Zone. This is from late 2019. After the 2019 election, Bolivia coup led by Christian fascist paramilitary leader and millionaire with foreign support. And so this is just about the time COVID is beginning to appear in the world. We're hearing all about how Donald Trump had a quid pro quo with Volodymyr Zelensky. This is the period of the lead up to the Ukraine impeachment hoax and to the very deadly pandemic hoax. So we have a Christian fascist millionaire, according to Max Blumenthal, hard left son of Sidney Blumenthal, but Max Blumenthal also kind of has this tendency toward populism and anti-globalism, but also seems to be so deeply committed to leftism that he can't tell who the actual populists and anti-globalists are. From the article, when Luis Fernando Camacho stormed into Bolivia's abandoned presidential palace in the hours after President Evo Morales' sudden November 10th resignation, he revealed to the world a side of the country that stood at stark odds with the plurinational spirit its deposed socialist and indigenous leader had put forward. With a Bible in one hand and a national flag in the other, Camacho bowed his head in prayer above the presidential seal, fulfilling his vow to purge his country's native heritage from government and, quote, return God to the burned palace, end quote. Pachamama will never return to the palace, declared the pastor to his side, referring to the Andean Mother Earth spirit. Bolivia belongs to Christ. That is rather remarkable. It sounds like he is declaring that secularism or even paganism have been removed from the Bolivian government. Back to Gray Zone, Bolivia's extreme right-wing opposition had overthrown leftist President Evo Morales that day, following demands by the country's military leadership that he step down. Virtually unknown outside his country, where he had never won a democratic election, Camacho stepped into the void. He is a powerful multimillionaire named in the Panama Papers and an ultra-conservative Christian fundamentalist groomed by a fascist paramilitary notorious for its racist violence, with a base in Bolivia's wealthy separatist region of Santa Cruz. Camacho hails from a family of corporate elites who have long profited from Bolivia's plentiful natural gas reserves, and his family lost part of its wealth when Morales nationalized the country's resources in order to fund his vast social programs, which cut poverty by 42% and extreme poverty by 60%. In the lead up to the coup, Camacho met with leaders from right-wing governments in the region to discuss their plans to destabilize Morales. 2 months before the putsch, he tweeted gratitude. "Thank you, Colombia. Thank you, Venezuela," he exclaimed, tipping his hat to Juan Guaido's coup operation. He also recognized the far-right government of Jair Bolsonaro, declaring, "Thank you, Brazil." And one more note from the article. Following the forced departure of Morales, coup leaders arrested the president and vice president of the government's electoral body and forced the organization's other officials to resign. Camacho's followers proceeded to burn Pala flags that symbolized the country's indigenous population and the plurinational vision of Morales. The Organization of American States, a pro-U.S. organization founded by Washington during the Cold War, is an alliance of right-wing anti-communist countries in Latin America. They helped rubber stamp the Bolivian coup. It called for new elections, claiming there were numerous irregularities in the October 20th vote without citing any evidence. Then OAS remained silent as Morales was overthrown by his military and his party's officials were attacked and violently forced to resign. Now, on the same day that Max Blumenthal is having a meltdown over this man, Luis Fernando Camacho, President Donald Trump released an official White House statement on the resignation of Evo Morales. The resignation yesterday of Bolivian President Evo Morales is a significant moment for democracy in the Western Hemisphere. After nearly 14 years and his recent attempt to override the Bolivian Constitution and the will of the people, Morales' departure preserves democracy and paves the way for the Bolivian people to have their voices heard. The United States applauds the Bolivian people for demanding freedom and the Bolivian military for abiding by its oath to protect not just a single person, but Bolivia's constitution. These events send a strong signal to the illegitimate regimes in Venezuela and Nicaragua that democracy and the will of the people will always prevail. We are now one step closer to a completely democratic, prosperous, and free Western Hemisphere. So that is quite interesting. For what it's worth, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said what is happening in Bolivia at the moment is not democracy. It is a coup d'etat. The people of Bolivia deserve free, fair, and peaceful elections and not to be subjected to violent takeovers. So Trump called the stepping down of Morales a win, and a year later, as the situation finally was resolved and Morales' mentee, Arce, was installed as the new president after over 88% of the country turned out to vote, Arce went and imprisoned Áñez and Camacho, accusing them of plotting a coup, and with Camacho going as far as to accuse him of committing terrorism. Which brings us all the way back to the so-called coup we saw yesterday. That, even according to globalist think tanks, may well have been a false flag. It may well have been staged. Zuniga was demanding freedom for Áñez and Camacho, but then gave up almost immediately and told the press that Arce had asked him to stage the coup to increase his own popularity. Then Zuniga and two other military leaders were arrested and replaced, and all of the soldiers just went on home. But what else is all of this about? Let's go back to 2019 when Morales was president. This is the Associated Press. Bolivian president visits Russia to discuss expanding ties. Bolivian leader Evo Morales has visited Russia for talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin on expanding economic ties. Speaking after talks in the Kremlin Thursday, Putin hailed the strategic cooperation between the two countries, including Russia's investment in Bolivia's natural gas fields and a project to build a Russian research nuclear reactor in the country. He said Russian companies are considering investments in lithium mining in Bolivia and plan to participate in the planned reconstruction of Santa Cruz Airport. Both leaders noted they have similar views on international issues and underlined their shared emphasis on respect for sovereignty and opposition to unilateral sanctions. Morales praised Putin for leading global efforts to protect international order, oppose use of force in international affairs, and prevent interference into other nations' internal affairs. And all of that is quite interesting. That suggests that Evo Morales and maybe the person he mentored, Arce, might be very interested in the emergence of this multipolar world order, understanding that their history of subjugation to the global regime means they're going to have their government and their society destabilized again and again and again. 200 coups in 190 years. Let's bring this back up to the present. This is just 2 weeks ago, June 12th, 2024. This article is from MercoPress.com, the South Atlantic news agency. Bolivian president outlines scope of partnership with Russia. Bolivian President Luis Arce Catacora reviewed with his Russian colleague Vladimir Putin the joint lithium and nuclear projects with which the South American country consolidates its position from a geopolitical and strategic viewpoint, given the presence of Iranian facilities and equipment. Arce told reporters in La Paz Tuesday that all of these matters were discussed during his recent meeting with the Russian leader in St. Petersburg on the occasion of the International Economic Forum, SPIEF, in the former imperial capital. According to Arce, the project involving Russia's Uranium One company regarding direct lithium extraction in Bolivian salt flats must start operating in 2025, while that company and the state-owned Yacimientos de Litio Bolivianos, quote, are going to take all the necessary measures to achieve this, end quote. And then we have this from last week, June 19th. This is ChinaDaily.com, Chinese state media. I know that's absolutely horrifying. This is more than amply supported elsewhere and not really in dispute, so I feel just fine using it. The headline, BRICS ties eyed as multipolar trend emerges. Diversification of partnerships sought as Nicaragua, Bolivia look to join group. The significant interest of Bolivia and Nicaragua joining the BRICS group highlights the growing economic ties within the group's members, in particular with China, while reducing their dependency on Western economies, say experts. Key officials from the Latin American countries announced their intentions during a 2-day BRICS gathering in Russia earlier this month. It is seen as a strategic move to enhance their economic prospects through collaboration with BRICS that includes original members Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus new entries that include Egypt, Iran, and Ethiopia. The involvement of countries like Bolivia and Nicaragua in BRICS has the potential to rebalance economic influences and create a more multipolar global economy, said Gabriel Moreno, a researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council of Argentina and professor at the National University of La Plata. The bids by Bolivia and Nicaragua reflect a broader trend in Latin America to diversify economic alliances and straighten ties with major global developing economies like China. Bolivia and China have grown increasingly close, with Beijing providing growing financial support as well as currency and infrastructure development. The article quotes an expert who describes the economic issues Bolivia has had this year as being the product of a reduction in exports, which is the sort of thing you would expect in a country that is currently being leveraged by the global regime. They have a long history of cutting off trade to certain countries and trying to impoverish them. It is exactly that sort of dependence that makes all of these countries want to be done with the global regime once and for all. The tactic is slightly different, but the strategy is about the same as when sanctions are applied. Economic warfare is being waged against a country and the people suffer the most. And then it's just a matter of whether or not the leaders can outlast that. And that is often a factor of the media influence being used to affect public sentiment. And who's controlling the media? Oh, that same global regime. Now, why would the global regime be punishing them with this sort of boycott of exports? And it turns out this article from October 31st of last year gives us kind of a hint. This is from The Guardian. South American countries recall ambassadors and cut ties with Israel over war with Hamas. A number of South American countries have registered diplomatic protests against Israel in response to its latest conflict with Hamas, with Bolivia's left-wing government cutting ties entirely and attributing its decision to alleged war crimes and human rights abuses being committed in the Gaza Strip. Hours later, the governments of Chile and Colombia recalled their ambassadors from Israel, while Brazil's president criticized the continued airstrikes on Gaza. Bolivia's deputy foreign minister, Freddie Mamani Machaka, said the decision represented a repudiation and condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate Israeli military offensive in the Gaza Strip and its threat to international peace and security. The move came after the former president, Evo Morales, called for his country to sever ties with Israel because of the, quote, horrific situation facing the Palestinian people. Writing on X, formerly known as Twitter. Earlier this month, Morales demanded Israel be classified as a terrorist state, and for the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his accomplices be denounced to the International Criminal Court for genocide and war crimes. So what do we have? Bolivia seems to be embracing the emergence of the multipolar world order and trying to sever its ties with the quote-unquote West, with the global regime. To whatever extent you identify yourself with the quote-unquote West and you identify what we call Western culture with the quote-unquote West, I think it's sort of time that we begin thinking of ourselves and what we appreciate about Western culture as distinct from what we refer to as the quote-unquote West. That is more or less a euphemism for the global regime, for the American/British Empire, for the UN and the EU, these globalist organizations. Bolivia is essentially reclaiming its own lithium, its own gas, deciding who it wants to do business with. They're talking about nuclear energy. They're joining BRICS, and they have severed diplomatic ties with Israel. If that is not a complete rejection of the global regime, I don't know what is. So then the question becomes, is Arce, and was Morales before him, are these politicians actually the choice of the Bolivian people? Or did they back the imprisoned coup plotters Áñez and Camacho? Zuniga demanded their freedom, but also said that Arce set all of this up as a staged coup, and it seems that the people in the globalist think tanks agree that it was a staged coup, a false flag. But then who staged it? Did Áñez and Camacho stage it? Zuniga there to guarantee their freedom? Well, if that was the case, it certainly didn't work. But again, the event itself is probably fake, so the likelihood that the people in prison set up a fake coup sounds very low. Arce and Morales were said to be split and at odds, but they both denounced the coup publicly and asked the Bolivian people to rise against it. But then the coup disappeared almost as quickly as it arose. And all that happened was that 3 military leaders were replaced. Was the coup being plotted by Zuniga and those other 2 military leaders who were replaced, and everyone else just went along with it to see them carry out the act so that the coup itself could be proven and they would be found guilty? Well, it's possible, and maybe even likely, because the military didn't go along with them. It immediately accepted the new command, which indicates the acceptance of the president's legitimacy or authority, at least for now. Or maybe these are all just puppets before the military and the military is in control. Or maybe, just maybe, it was an attempt by the global regime who have tried to overthrow Bolivia countless times in the past. Maybe they thought they had Bolivia's military on their side, and they could pin responsibility on Áñez and Camacho. Or if it failed, they could pin it on Arce and Morales. But the fact that it was so obviously staged means it can't be pinned on anyone but them. And over the coming days and weeks, as events evolve and more information emerges, maybe we'll understand exactly what happened. But no matter what, we see that same push and pull, the same issues coming up, and the same tactics being deployed. The emergence of the multipolar world and the desperate attempts by the one world liberal international rules-based order to maintain their grip on control. I will be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'm your moderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's